All right, we should be live here. Hello and welcome. I am so excited you are here to join us. Welcome to the Social Distance Book Fest, where you can stay at home while supporting authors and indie bookstores and hopefully add a few books to your ever-growing, never-ending TBR. I am Cami, and this is Cami's Corner. And my channel is predominantly horror, so that is why I was asked to host this panel. I consider myself a lover of the macabre and cover books, movies, and just about all things spooky. So here today we are going to be hosting an amazing group of authors. I am beyond excited, and as I was telling them beforehand, I am trying not to fangirl here. I am going to keep this as professional as possible. But today we are going to be discussing Beyond Stephen King, New Frontiers in Horror. And I think that is perfectly titled because I think so often as a reader of horror, and it being, my continual go-to for a genre, so often many people wonder, what else is out there. Danielle is discussing Beyond Stephen King, New Frontiers. Somebody has some background noise. I'm not, maybe that was Danielle coming in. Yeah, just make sure if you are also simultaneously watching this live on YouTube that you do have that portion muted, so that way we just don't get the background interference. Welcome, Danielle. Nice to have you. I think she'll join us visually back in just a moment. So often people wonder, what else is there out there? And I think that this is such a perfect panel of authors to not only showcase that different diversity out there in horror, but you really are the movers and shakers of what's going on in the horror community right now. I mean, your books, absolutely, your most recent titles have blown me away. I'm just, as someone who reads horror quite frequently, I was amazed by the stories, where they went, where they took me, and I can't speak highly enough. But I'm going to give you guys the opportunity to have the platform. I'd like you to go ahead and just introduce yourselves, and from here, just let everybody know who you are, what your preferred pronouns are, and of course talk about your most recent release. We'll go ahead and start with you, Ms. Molly.
Okay, sorry. Okay, my name is Molly Polig, and I use she, her pronouns, and I have just written my first book. This is The Unsuitable, which is about a Victorian woman who she's approaching spinsterhood, and she believes that her dead mother lives inside of her neck. So she's not having an easy time finding someone. So it's really up to the reader to decide through a series of events if she is possessed or if she's mad.
Nice. Sounds great.
Thanks.
And Stephen, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I am Stephen Graham Jones. I go by he, him, dude, and this is my novel that's coming out soon here. Let me get it in the place. The Only Good Indians.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And, oh, did I freeze? I didn't freeze, did I?
The internet couldn't handle his novel.
Are y'all hearing me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I've got a lot of books out. I write a lot of horror. I live in Boulder, Colorado. Let's see. I'm Blackfeet. I'm nearly 50 years old. I think that's about me.
Grady, you want to go next? And then I'll.
And Mr. Hendricks, you want to go next?
Claire, go for it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Claire Legrand. My pronouns are she, her, and I have several books out for kids and teens. And my 7th novel is Sawkill Girls, which is a young adult horror novel. I called it my Girl Gang versus Monster book for a long time. So it's about these 3 girls who live on the island of Sawkill Rock, where girls have been disappearing for decades and nobody really knows why. So these 3 girls from very different walks of life with very different backgrounds and stories come together to try to figure out the mystery of what is hunting the girls on this island. And what they find may or may not be a metaphor for the patriarchy. And smashing that in various ways. There's interdimensional travel and sentient rocks and all kinds of moths that talk and all kinds of weird, eerie stuff that was really, really fun to write. So that's Sawkill Girls.
Wonderful. Grady, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Grady Hendricks. I write horror, he, him. I wrote a book called Horror Store about a haunted IKEA, my best friend's exorcism. I did a book about the history of horror paperbacks in the 70s and 80s called Paperbacks from Hell. And my new book is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which is about a book club in Charleston, South Carolina, where I'm from, that a bunch of women belong to it, and they believe that one of their new neighbors is, in fact, either a serial killer or a vampire. Neither theory gets them much credibility, and they make a series of increasingly poor decisions. And it just became a New York Times bestseller, which is really nice in the middle of all this Red Death. So yeah, I feel very lucky.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
And lastly, but of course, not definitely in any order, Ms. Danielle Trissoni. She was having some technical.
Oh my God, was I ever?
There for a moment. She's gonna. It's okay. It happens. You know, this is part of going live. You just never know what's gonna happen. In any event, please introduce yourself to the audience. Let us know what your preferred pronouns are, and please let us know about your latest work.
So I'm Danielle Trissoni, and I am a writer that basically is trans genre, I would say, because I've written in many different genres, many different styles. I am the horror columnist for the New York Times Book Review. I've also been a judge for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. My first novels, Angelology and Angelopolis, were a series that were New York Times bestsellers. And my most recent novel is The Ancestor, which just came out.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you all so much for joining us. Let me just let our audience know kind of what the Social Book Fest is. Essentially, this is an all-day event that's taking place through the YouTube platform. It is created by a dedicated group of bookworms that cover all corners of the internet. It includes 18 panels and more than 80 authors, virtual fan meetups, as well as signing opportunities and some amazing giveaways. Be sure to check out our website, and all of our social media is going to be linked in my description below. So if you have any questions, please feel free to also leave a comment with those questions. And after the live, this will appear on my channel at Cammie's Corner, and I will be sure to go back and answer those questions and make sure that all of the direction is headed into the right area of this festival, so that way you can not only get what you need, but also support some amazing authors. Also here, we want to ensure that you adhere to the link, because the link that does take you to the indie bookstore, 10% of those proceeds will be donated to the Center for Disaster Philanthropies for COVID-19 Fund. And so we'll hope you'll take advantage of this, and of course, everything that the Book Fest has to offer. In case you missed any of these interesting panels, because there are 2 panels that will be correlated at the same time throughout the day, then make sure just to check out the individual respective channels hosting that, as it will be included in their playlist as it becomes readily available for viewing. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this exciting panel. I always kind of like to shake it up just a little bit and start with an icebreaker, just to kind of get the nerves off of us, because I think we're, you know, all got a little bit of ice on us. So let's talk about horror, and let's specifically look at either a favorite horror film or a favorite horror book. And tell me what yours is. You can choose either or both, and what you love about it. We'll start with you again, Miss Molly.
Oh, I would say my favorite horror movies are definitely going to be some Japanese horror movies. Takashi Miike, just as gross as you can get. But then I'd say my favorite horror novel, I'm not even sure it's classified as horror. It's called The Mustache by Emmanuel Carrera, and it's about a man. He's married. He one day says to his wife, well, what would happen if I shaved off my mustache? And they joke about it. And then she goes away for a little while, and he shaves it off. And then she comes back. She doesn't say anything. He says, why didn't you notice that I shaved my mustache? And she says, what mustache? you've never had a mustache. And then his whole life just spins out of control after that. So
That sounds great.
How about yourself, Stephen? What's a favorite horror film or book that you would recommend?
Oh, the last few years I go in like spurts where I read one horror novel over and over until I feel like I know it well enough. The last few years I've been reading and rereading two novels, The Shining, Stephen King, and Gemma Files's experimental film. I've read each of those a few times, just trying to figure out the magic of how they work. So maybe they're my favorites for right now, unless it's Grady's current one, of course.
Thank you.
Your check is in the mail.
And with that, we'll segue into you, Mr. Hendricks. What is your favorite recommendation for maybe a horror movie or book?
Well, right now, I a lot of the stuff I read are sort of, I still am reading too many paperback horror novels from the 80s and 90s, just because I got addicted and I don't have the excuse of I'm doing a book and so it's research anymore. So it's just my own shame. But right now, my niece just gave me this amazing book, and I wish I had it here, but called Southpaw. That is about a werewolf on a baseball team, and he's a lefty pitcher. So if his problems weren't bad enough, but I'm like halfway through it, and I love. I mean, it's terrible, but it's amazing. It's like there have been a couple of horror basketball novels I've read where like it's always like a possessed basketball, and like people sell their souls to be really great, and it's always high school basketball, which I'm like, I at least hold out for like the NBA or something, but these kids like sell their souls to be great at their high school team. But so far, Southpaw is doing it for me. But the stuff I've been going back to for comfort is Shirley Jackson wrote a couple of, I guess you'd call them domestic books, Life Among the Savages and Raising Demons, which are sort of just not really memoirs. They're kind of based on articles she did for magazines about her family and being a mom and also being a writer. And they fit in that sort of domestic kind of category, but they're amazing. I mean, she's so precise and razor sharp in her writing. And when she turns that to comedy, it's just one like laser guided sentence after another. So, and they're great for right now because they're super funny.
That's a great recommendation. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks to you, I have increased my paperbacks from hell exponentially. My pocketbook does not love you.
I'm sorry. I feel guilty and responsible.
Don't apologize. No, please don't. You've actually opened my eyes to a completely different world of horror, because I'm kind of stuck in between what you were talking about in that book and my own generation. And so it's kind of brought me up to be the horror aficionado that I claim to be today. So thank you. Miss LeGrand, let's talk horror. What's your favorite movie or book?
Well, two horror films that I keep coming back to and have since I was like, I guess in high school was when I first saw these films, are The Ring, the remake that came out in 2002 starring Naomi Watts, and then Alien. I keep coming back to those two again and again because I feel like the atmosphere in each film is just so perfectly crafted. And I love, that's one of my favorite things to do when I write, is build the atmosphere and the texture of a story. So I love those two films as far as how they establish the textures of these story worlds. I just think they're so immaculately crafted. And then as far as horror novels go, I really just recommend highly anything by Frances Hardinge. She writes historical fiction. It's not true historical fiction, but it's like creepy, macabre horror fiction with an historical bent. And her writing is just gorgeous. It's an incredibly atmospheric writing. Cuckoo Song and The Lie Tree are two particular favorites of mine. She is fantastic. I think she just had a new book come out, and I can't remember the title right now, but her entire catalog is great. So highly recommend her.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. How about you, Miss Danielle? What do you have to offer this session?
So I spend so much time reading new horror fiction for my column. I get probably 15 books a month, at least, all new horror novels. So it's, I don't have the luxury, I wish I did, to read one novel over and over and just absorb it anymore. But something that I have been sort of obsessed with for the past few years is sort of contemporary Gothic like Sarah Perry, for example, or Jess Kidd. This sort of like neo-Victorian, lush, Baroque feeling, atmospheric, Gothic fiction that plays with genre, but is also quite literary in that it's gesturing back to, say, the Brontes, or gesturing back to the 19th century in a way that I find really interesting and evocative, and not typical for what we would call horror. I love horror that folds in other genres.
I completely agree. And I think that's so important, especially for really the feel of this panel, is just getting readers to know that there's so much more to horror. It's so much deeper. There's over 30 subgenres of horror. And so there literally is something for everyone. So I really get excited when someone tells me that horror is not their niche, or that they don't read horror. I'm like, yeah, come talk to me. I will find you something that you can read. And I think that each of you really depict that so perfectly and so naturally, because after having read all of your latest work, even someone who reads horror on a regular basis, I was blown away by just how many layers there were to your stories. I found myself thinking, I know where this is going, I know how this is going to end, and you just all surprised me in such amazing ways. So hats off to you. I'm absolutely flabbergasted with everything that I've read recently, and I'm just so pleased that I did fit in all your books before we got to speak, because such a treat. And I've been recommending your books like crazy to people. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
as we kind of, oh, most definitely, as we're kind of looking at horror as a whole too, it seems like horror has made a resurgence, and I think this comes up as a topic of conversation amongst the horror community quite often, where we kind of see this pattern where there's certain authors that maybe start writing again, or they're influencing new writers, and right now it just seems to be this growth. Do you all see, from your perspective as authors, that this is a growth that you think will continue, or do you think that this kind of just comes in waves? What trends are you noticing in this genre? And really feel free to speak on any level of that. We'll start with you this time, Stephen.
What trends? Well, number one, you're asking if it's going to continue, and I think it'll continue for a while. I mean, we all know that horror peaks in times of uncertainty, and that's where we're living right now, of course. So I think we're still on the rise, but everything moves in cycles of boom and bust too. So we could, like the slasher in the late '80s or in the mid '80s, we could get so heavy with all these ridiculous conventions that we have to fall down for a while. I don't know. But as for what I see trend wise, I think on screen there's less exploitation than there used to be, or at least maybe my tastes have moved to a different place. I don't know. And as for the page, I feel like the last 12 or 15 years, independent presses have been really introducing interesting DNA into the horror genre, and it's kind of coming to fruition now with this current place we're at with horror.
Agreed. How about you, Grady?
Oh, I have a heart. Other people pay a lot more attention to publishing than I do, which is probably why my career is what it is. But I have a hard time keeping up. I always feel like horror never went away. Like maybe it got less attention. But like The Walking Dead's been this enormously popular show, and a comic before that for a really long time. I mean, Buffy, my sisters still worship at that altar on a regular basis, even though the show's been off the air for a while. Supernatural's been running since I think my second birthday, my third birthday. Like, I feel like there's so much of it that's always been around. And I do think maybe it gets more and less mainstream attention, but I just feel like it's kind of constant. King puts out a book a year, whether anyone's looking or not,
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like the world is always going to be a scary and weird and uncertain place. And I think people continue to turn to genre fiction, but specifically horror, as a way of processing those fears and processing the unknown. I think both readers do that and creators do that. I feel like right now I'm working on a horror novel, and it feels so perfect because I get to work through all of my fear and uncertainty about the world through writing this book. And I think it can be a very cathartic process. As far as trends, I love in film, I love what Jordan Peele did with Get Out and Us, and I love seeing how he's like telling horror stories through a Black lens. And I love seeing just all more stories told by people of different genders and races and sexual identities and cultures, because I feel like listening to other people's stories, but specifically stories about what their fears are and sort of what primal things make them tick, is a really interesting way of figuring out how we can understand each other better and therefore have more compassion for each other. I think horror is such a primal key into understanding people's psyches. And so I'm really excited to see just more varied kinds of stories coming into the genre.
Absolutely. Danielle, how about yourself?
So just playing off what Claire was saying, I think that the genre is in some ways kind of exploding right now. I think that there's a fragmentation. We all used to think of, maybe not all of us, but a lot of people, if you just pulled someone off the street and said, what's horror? They would say Clive Barker, Stephen King. Like they would just have this very narrow view of what horror was. And, you know, the general reaction for a lot, especially a lot of women, was, I don't like horror because of that, right? Because it felt like it was an attack on women, and it was about, you know, it was very bloody, and, you know, all of the nuance of, say, Rosemary's Baby, or, you know, these brilliant films that, you know, or even going farther back, you know, the 19th century with Mary Shelley and the Brontes and all of the foundational writers. All of that sort of got lost, it seems to me, in the popular consciousness, got lost a little bit. But now when you talk to people about horror, they do bring up Jordan Peele, or, for example, a movie that came out just a few months ago, The Invisible Man, which was, you know, really interesting in the way that it twisted domestic violence into a horror film that was both extremely tense and engaging and really interesting, but also said something on top of it. And I'm seeing that a lot in the books I'm getting to review. I'm seeing that a lot in contemporary publishing. I love that there's, you know, that the definitions of horror are not only expanded, but that publishing is being more inclusive. And, you know, there's just so many more, I mean, Grady probably would be able to counter this, because you have such a, like an encyclopedic, you know, sort of collection of horror from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you know.
Oh, it's sad, I know.
But, you know, from my point of view, it does seem to me to be expanding and becoming more nuanced, and for me, more interesting.
And Molly?
I feel very naive in this conversation, because I feel like I don't really seek out that much in terms of horror books. I watch a lot more horror films. But one thing I kind of seen that seems interesting to me is that there are more things, I think, coming out, and they've come out in recent times, set in the past, instead of like the dystopian trend that's been going for a very long time. And it sort of seems to me that dystopia is now, so maybe everyone doesn't really want to read that right now. So then you have books like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, or a movie like The Witch, which I love those. I love taking that historical perspective, like Danielle said, and throwing in a modern angle to it.
And that's interesting that you say that, because I think that, at least within the horror community, I've noticed a lot of people saying that as we're kind of embracing this new normal, and we typically, you know, gravitate to horror, we're finding ourselves kind of looking at other areas of our bookshelves right now, just as we kind of grace the, you know, the next steps or the next phases of this. But for me, I'm horror all the time. You know, maybe I'm just a weirdo. I don't know. I, you know, tend to just gravitate to what I know. And I'm like, you know, bring it on, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a virus, what have you, I will still want to read that. Despite, I think for me, horror is just normal, you know, and I think it helps to normalize everything else. And so if I was trying to read something else, I think it would be a little bit of a distraction, and it wouldn't be truthful to who I am. I think there was a lot of talk on diversity within the answer of that question. So I want to just shift the focus just ahead a little bit. until more recently, the horror genre has lacked diversity in terms of race, gender, sexuality, even in the narrative as far as formatting is concerned. All of you bring something very different to the table, but I think each of you speak to this. Can you talk about what inspires your writing and why that's so important to the future of horror in terms of remaining diverse? Let's start with you on this, Grady.
Oh, let's start with the white guy to talk about diversity. I don't know what I bring to the table. Honestly, like I don't think about that stuff a whole lot. I mean, in terms of my writing, something you just said though, and it's something Danielle brought up a little bit. There is this image of horror as this boys thing, and I feel like Danielle mentioned Mary Shelley, which is like the first horror novel people still actually read, and I think no one could argue that like Toni Morrison's Beloved or like Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House are probably the two great horror novels of the 20th century. I mean, you can argue it, but you'd be a jerk. Like, and I feel like, as big as Stephen King and Clive Barker were in the 80s, there was also V.C. Andrews and Anne Rice. And I feel like a lot of women get female authors get written out of history a little bit more so than they were big at the time. They just get pushed aside and forgotten. And so like I've been working with Valancourt to bring a lot of old horror novels back into print. And we try really hard to find women's who have been forgotten, who maybe their books were bestsellers in the day, like Barry Wood or Joan Sampson, but they've been sort of erased because it's unfortunate. That's how people think. I really see horror as a more of a women's genre, to be honest. I feel like an interloper a lot of the time. And I think the one thing that's really changed in terms of having more racially diverse voices has more to do with sort of publishing changing rather than horror specifically. Publishing's really trying to be a lot more inclusive, and horror is doing the same thing. And I think also we're policing the borders of what genre is less than we used to. Like, I feel like it used to be, if your book isn't exactly within these boundaries with a supernatural aspect, it's not horror. And I feel like now writers like Gabino Iglesias or Carmen Maria Machado, who, yes, they're sold more as literary fiction, but I feel like the horror community really embraces them as kindred spirits. So I feel like the borders of genre have been policed less heavily, and I feel like publishing's changed, and horror has too, which, is for the better as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and what Grady's saying there, I agree that I think like Shirley Jackson, we all consider her a horror writer, but she has been kind of stolen by people who don't like horror and made not mainstream. That's the wrong way. I mean, maybe literary, maybe that's the way to say it. But to me, yeah, Shirley Jackson is still horror. Even when she's being funny, she's still being like demonically funny, But
what's hilarious though is that she was published in the New Yorker.
Yeah.
Weird. So let's talk about what genre is and why the New Yorker now would almost never publish a horror writer, or I can't think of any. So I think that it's a really interesting question to talk about what that is, what genre is, and who gets to claim, right? Like who gets to claim who? It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Well, I always find it weird that the horror genre doesn't grab on to Beloved by Toni Morrison the way that sci-fi grabs onto The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, as this sort of standard bearer. Like, oh, you guys, it won all these awards. You guys read this book. It's sci-fi. It's that's always confused me. I don't know. I mean, Danielle, you read probably more than any of us about the current stuff that's coming out, like just for work.
Like stacked up everywhere.
But do you find that those borders are getting more porous between sort of like, the
literary community, like the so-called literary fiction? I went to Iowa. I started my first book was, literary. It was in the top 10, books of the year. Oh, this weird thing is coming on my screen. I keep having technical problems. I'm sorry. I have like a bubble that just keeps coming on my screen. Anyway, I'm being haunted. And so I have some real issue with the whole idea of literary versus genre, right? I don't think, I actually have read all of your books in the course of my reviewing. job. And I think everyone on this panel would, in my opinion, would be a literary writer, right? The idea that we would ghettoize or, like cordon off a certain type of writing into sci-fi and horror and literary, etc. And when I was reading for the Pulitzer in fiction a couple of years ago, many of the books that were contenders were less well written than a lot of the horror novels that were coming across my desk. So I think that these genres, it's time to break them down completely. I don't like them. I think great writing is great writing, and I think great storytelling is great storytelling. And it's time to get rid of it completely. I don't know where we would be if we did that, but that's just it'd be a big chaos.
Marketing departments would have a conniption.
I know. I mean, that's why these genres exist, right? It's marketing departments, booksellers, libraries. They need to put things somewhere. But, after I'm sure you guys get this too, like after you have the umpteenth librarian say, where the hell do I put your books? It's like, I don't know. I mean, because angelology, for example, the horror community never embraced angelology as a horror novel. Although I think it does have a lot of elements of horror fiction. Nobody knew where to put it. Literary fiction, genre fiction, sci-fi, historical, like no one knew. And I think that there should just be, I don't know, a category called good writing.
Yeah, I think so too. When the librarians ask where to put my books, I always say just right by the very front,
In the window.
No, those are all very good points, because I think that now, as we're kind of seeing the horror genre touch on various things, I mean, I felt that way with all three females on this panel today reading your books. I was asking myself as a reader, where is my mind going with this? Because, thinking I've read this type of story before, going in with an anticipation of the type of book that I was advised it would be, this fits in this category, say per se gothic horror, and then I'm seeing elements of various other things. It does take your mind to a completely different place, and it awakens this I don't know, just this crazy animal within you, because you're like, oh my God, maybe I'm changing, maybe my tastes are changing. I just wasn't aware this kind of thing existed. So I can just imagine how our librarians are feeling, where do I place this book? How do I sell this? How do I market it? And as someone who is, a reader and reviewer, and the reviews are so important, but sometimes I find myself doing that when I sit down to, place that review, because I want to do you as the author justice, but I also want to make sure that I'm not steering the potential reader coming in astray. I want to let them know kind of what they're up against. And it's a checks and balance system for sure, especially when you guys throw me for a loop and throw in some crazy thing. I'm like, oh my God, now what do I say here? How am I going to?
But that's what we do. That's the definition of what we do.
But you know what, on that same note, what you were saying about how so many aspects of the writers that are here today are literary, I also felt that. I just felt, very distinguished reading all of your novels. I thought, man, I kind of feel smart reading these novels today, because they take you into such a very different place. I mean, the level of the tone, the verbiage, the choice of vocabulary. I mean, you really have to get your mind wrapped around some of these things. And I think that is why it's so important to promote horror and to let people know there really is something out there for everyone, and don't dismiss it, because just although horror has seemed to kind of fit this bubble in the past, it's very different now, and there really is these exciting nuances that kind of happen around the corner, and things that just even for someone who reads as much as I do, I still get surprised. So it's a great thing that's happening, and it just really this starts and ignites this fire within you, and you're just like, okay, who can I tell, who can I share this with? I just want to let the world know. Following up on that last question and kind of just everything that we've been discussing here, I want to look more towards my female authors here when I pose this. Writing as a woman in horror, because I know that we touched on, and that was why I had pulled up that particular comment that I had up on the screen by Revolver Solver. When we're looking in terms of bookstores and so forth, the push is on male authors. There's always, King has a new book. Let's push it to the front. We don't see a lot from Kuntz, although I think he did release just today. I saw on Twitter he's coming out with another novel. But in terms of writing as a female author, what is it that, I guess, how do I want to word this? In a typically dominated male genre, what are your experiences writing like on your perspective as a female versus, say, differentiating genres or relating to other types of readers? What would you have to offer readers?
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So you're asking, as female authors in a somewhat male-dominated genre, you're asking like what kind of new perspective we bring to the genre, or like what we offer readers through our perspectives?
Yes, your experience is writing as a horror author as a female. What does that perspective bring in a typically male-dominated genre?
Sure. Is it okay if I jump in, Molly and Danielle?
Oh yeah.
So my experience, I guess I'm fairly new to the genre. My first book, which came out in 2012, is actually a horror novel for children. It's called The Cavendish Home for Boys and Girls. But I still feel like, even though my first book was horror and my 7th book was horror and my 11th book next summer is also horror, I feel like I'm still new to the genre. But so far, writing in this genre has been a really positive and empowering experience. I have been very choosy about the horror movies that I've watched throughout my life because a lot of them made me feel unsafe, because a lot of the female characters were in great danger, and danger that I felt was disproportional to the danger that the male characters were in. So like as a kid and as a teenager, I often felt, again, unsafe in the environment of those movies. And so it's been really a positive experience to take that fear and that feeling of danger that I experienced as a kid and write books that I hope, especially for my female readers, feel like even if something is scary and things are very dark in the story, that they still feel like, especially because I write for young readers, I want them to still feel like they are being led through the story by somebody who understands their particular vulnerabilities and their particular fears, and they are being led through the story by someone who is going to get them through it okay. Like, I want my especially young female readers to feel safe when they read my books. And I hope that I've achieved that. Yeah.
I kind of feel that in a way, even though I wrote an adult book. So my main character struggles a lot with mental illness and self-harm. And I think there's so many ways in that women throughout history have been taught that we're sort of monstrous and you have to hide that part of yourself. And that's what mental illness is. And I wanted her to be a character that not necessarily someone could see themselves in, because that's a little much, but see bits of themselves in, see things that they've experienced with feeling no connection with the world, feeling all alone. And it's funny, I didn't know I wrote a horror novel until I was sort of told later, but it's these horrific things about yourself, if you know there's other people experiencing the same thing, it's comforting.
Your book was so powerful to me because I don't personally know anyone that struggles at that level, and it helped me so significantly understand what potentially someone goes through in those moments of darkness. I resonated with your, like, I don't want to say resonated because that means, I would have some understanding of what she's gone through, but I guess I connected with your character so much more than I thought I would, and I was crying with her, and I was rooting for her, and I was just, oh my God, that character is top notch. One of the best, hands down, one of the best characters ever written. I was just floored. For a debut novel, ma'am, you have gone above and beyond. I cannot wait for your next book.
Me too.
I cannot scream praises about this book enough. It's amazing. And it's difficult because that's one of those types of books that it's a hard sell because it is very intense. There's a lot of dark moments. There's a lot of, just beyond mental trauma, there's self-harm, and there's, it's dark, it's rich. But in any event, it's so important. And when I talk about your book, I tell every female they should read this, because you need to know this, you need to hear this, you need to feel this. I mean, I didn't know I needed to feel this. And I'll stop now, because I could literally do this with each of you, but I just need you to know how powerful that female character is. It really resonated with me. And
Thank
Danielle, I know you need to jump in here and answer this, because I feel that your female characters, both yourself and Claire, they really do resonate with the female audience. And you wrote such a rich, powerful story with history too, and that was a dynamic element, because I thought, this is not something that is going to be my cup of tea, despite the fact that I love history. I was like, oh, this is going to be a big bore snooze, and you completely turned that around for me. I mean, your character, your book was just, I cannot speak highly enough. Carry on. I could go on all day.
So it's interesting, because I'm much more interested in narrative and world building and a whole bunch of other things than in representing femininity or female experience. I think my ultimate, the place where I hope to get one day, is a sort of androgynous imagination, the way that Virginia Woolf talks about thinking and being, and in fiction, where I could be equally invested in a male character as a female character and explore those realms equally. I don't know. I mean, I also write memoir, right? So I've written 3 novels and 2 sort of literary memoirs, and I sort of get out my dark female stuff in those memoirs, right? They're pretty hard to read, and I just get it out there. And then in my fiction, I like to open it up and look at things from a bigger, broader perspective. So for example, with The Ancestor, although it is a female protagonist, that, it's a female protagonist that's leading us. What's going on? What's going on?
You've got some amazing lighting.
All right. So, whoa, I don't know what's happening here. Okay. You know what?
We've just entered the castle with you. That's
sorry. Yeah, I really am. There's some spirits here. I just got to tell you all, there's like something going on. Okay, so even though my female I had a female protagonist in The Ancestor, I was much more interested in the view of looking at humanity and human identity rather than gender or race or our identity. So for those of you who haven't read the book, it's about a woman who discovers that she has a family in the Alps in Italy, and she goes there, and it ends up that her family is not fully human, right? And so, I mean, to just give it all away, but looking at humanity from the point of the non-human was much more interesting to me than looking at what my female character was experiencing or her femaleness, if you know what I'm saying. So, and I think that's always been more my interest than talking about me being a woman.
And Claire, lastly, in reference to, the female drive with your book, there was also kind of a mix of a little bit of what I felt was kind of middle grade, where there was a talk of the Wrinkle in Time and kind of how you transcended that into Sawkill Girls. Was that intentional to kind of mirror those, since you do write in the middle grade format as well, just to kind of bring those two collectives together? Or were you doing a retelling of sorts, to kind of give some of a different light, more like a, as you call it, your, girl gang, and kind of pulled it together through a story that's been told before from, like a familiarity?
Yeah, the Wrinkle in Time reference really came about organically because one of the characters is a big old nerd, and she is very well read, and how she understands the world is through the stories that she consumes. And so when she is faced with this very strange supernatural event, she puts it into the context of a book that she loves. And that's how she understands it. So that just sort of organically happened as I wrote. And I also, A Wrinkle in Time impressed upon me in a very significant way as a kid because I found it so scary. Like it's a speculative fiction, it's sci-fi, it's fantasy, it's one of those weird kind of genre-less things in my opinion. But toward the end, when the kids are facing the primary antagonist and facing off against this being, I found it horrifying as a kid, and I was entranced by this terrifying entity and this terrifying conflict. And so I think that because that text was so foundational to me as a kid, texts like that, I find they often trickle into my adult writing in ways that often surprise me. And so I think that was an instance of that happening.
I think each of you as authors do tend to write in a range of genres. And Danielle had mentioned this earlier, where she definitely identifies as such. When your gear switches to the macabre, and in terms of a natural writing process, is that something you have to prepare for, or is that something that just kind of comes into the story? Because even you touched on this, Molly, where you didn't feel like you wrote a horror novel, somebody had to bring it to your attention that it was. So do you think it just kind of is a story that you tell, and then these natural occurrences happen and you just kind of take it in that direction? Kind of explain that process in incorporating the macabre.
Should I start? I'll start.
Anyone can start.
It's funny. I don't think I wrote a horror novel, but also I really enjoy writing super gory scenes. I find it enjoyable, and it's probably because of all the Japanese and Korean horror films, to be honest. There's something, I like that visceral, I want to make people shudder a bit while still having empathy, I guess. But I don't find it hard, but I have to remind myself to have a sense of humor, because I think the scariest thing is it's a little more easy to take if somebody cracks a joke at some point after the jump scare, I guess.
Yeah. I'm a little with Molly. I feel like this is just the way the world looks to me. Like right before you have the most hideous car accident, everyone's in the car having a great time and making jokes. Every time I've had some gruesome injury or been around a gruesome injury, it's been a lot of fun right up until that moment. And I've had a lot of really fun funerals I've attended that have been real blasts. So, I feel like, the horror and the emotional stuff and the comedy, that's how life looks to me.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Sure. You talking about how to switch gears into horror, or I feel like I'm always in horror. I guess I feel like I'm always in horror gear. Early in my career, I started out thinking I was going to write Chekhov stories, Anton Chekhov. I was going to write about a guy looking out a window at a woman he used to love 20 years ago, and it was going to be sad and touching and timeless and all that stuff. But the trick is, I get bored about 2 pages in, and then here comes a sea monster to eat his dog, and then it's a big race, So, horror is just, I think I have to work really hard for something not to turn into horror, I guess is what I'm saying. I even, I've got a fantasy story out there that I thought I'm just going to write a straight fantasy story, but sure enough, the fantasy story ended up being about a guy who figures out that with centaurs, the meat between the human back and the horse back, that little sliver of meat tastes really, really good. So he goes around harvesting that meat from centaurs, So just what I'm interested in,
Yeah, I'm over here swooning at that. Like, oh, that's great. I think I did, I do too. I move in, I start with the best intentions to be, to walk a certain line, and then it just goes off. I go off. And I think it partially is the same problem. I get bored. I'm bored. If there's not something happening and something dark happening, it's not interesting to me. And I think that might have a lot to do with my childhood, which I had quite a dark childhood. And I wrote about that in my first book. And I think if you live with a certain tempo or rhythm and you get used to that, like something happening or someone dying or or there's no food or you're racing around trying to figure, at whatever it is, you bring that to your fiction and or whatever you're writing. And so I think that that's where that comes from. But even with my, with the memoirs I've written, the last one, someone said, I think this might be a horror memoir. And I'm like, is that a thing? Like, oh, wait, yeah, that must be a thing. But yeah, that's where I go. That's where my brain goes.
If anybody is going to make something a thing in horror, one of the five of you are going to make horror something of a thing that is not a thing yet. I can guarantee that. Of course, aside from your own books, there's a ton of books coming out. There always is. I mean, there's always something on the radar. What is on your radar right now? Tell me what everybody should be reading. Give me a recommendation to share with my audience to let them know what you are interested in reading, besides, of course, your own books, because I recommend every single book on this panel.
Well, a book that I have loved recently, I actually read an early copy of it and blurbed it and just absolutely fell in love, is Wilder Girls by Rory Power. It's like this really unflinchingly feminist body horror sci-fi kind of novel that spotlights the complex and powerful relationships between girls and specifically queer girls. And so if you liked Sawkill, if you liked the relationships in there and the exploration of what I like to call sapphic horror elements. If you liked those elements in Sawkill Girls, then I think you would absolutely love Wilder Girls. And Rory's next book, I think it's called Burn Our Bodies Down. I'm sure will explore a lot of those same themes and elements. I just can't get enough of her writing. I think it's fantastic.
I guess as far as radar goes, that's like a little blip that's getting closer and closer that I haven't read yet. The two next books I have queued up are Rachel Harrison's The Return and Christopher Buehlman's Between Two Fires. I think that Chris's is a fantasy novel. The Return is a horror novel.
So that was one of my recommendations too. I brought it to show people. That's on my radar. This is on my radar. Oops, my camera. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
Catherine House, which is great. And also everyone I'm sure knows this book and has probably read it. It's Alma's book.
Oh, that just came out. Yeah, it's great.
So anyway, those three are great and they're on my radar.
I also
it's not a book, but the thing that's blown me away the most recently, Gwendolyn Kiste or Kiste, Kiste. She just won the Stoker for this story, so it's probably not like unknown. But she wrote a short story called "The 8 Men Who Murdered Me" or "The 8 People Who Murdered Me," and it's on Nightmare Magazine right now. It's free; you can read it. Gwendolyn Kiste. It's one of the best things I've ever read. And I've had vampires on the brain for a while. And, it took me a really long time to let me convince my publisher to let me write a book about A, vampires, and B, middle-aged women. They're like, who wants to read about either of those things? And I'm like, that's the point. A lot of people. That she wrote, The 8 People Who Murdered Me. And it's fabulous.
Oh, I also am looking forward to reading Rachel Harrison's book, and also a book by Camilla Bruce called You Let Me In. Those, once I get to a point where I feel like reading again, which is anyone else having trouble reading? I can't. I can't. I have so many books and they're so ready. And
it's refreshing to hear authors say that, though, because as a reader reviewer, sometimes, well, you can see my TBR cart behind me. So clearly I've got plenty to choose from, but yeah, I can't stop. I can't let what's going on around me, because it would be triple the size of that when this is all over. And goodness willing, I really do hope all of this comes back to normal, our version of normal, very soon. But it'll be interesting to see what kind of novels come out of this, because as you all are sitting at home stewing with these ideas, I'm just going to be very interested to see where this, individual alone time takes you. So we have had a fantastic conversation. So we were really supposed to kind of break the last 20 minutes into audience questions and so forth, but everybody's just kind of been saying, you know, they're agreeing with you and, you know, just kind of going along with what we're saying here. So I definitely didn't want to kill the rush and the flow of this conversation, because it was fantastic. And I really knew it was going to be this powerful because the minds in this panel are astounding. I just knew this was going to be fantastic. So I will go ahead and take at least one audience question. We've got about 6 minutes left here before we wrap up. There was a question coming in, and I'll show it here for us, just to kind of blurb the line between what young adult horror is versus regular horror. And I think that this is a question that I look to a lot when there's that area of gray between what is considered like a middle grade and a YA, and then a YA and a new adult. You know, there is just so much, I mean, even just blending of the genre, like we've been talking about, there's so much blending of the age ranges now that we're seeing, and it's really hard to differentiate sometimes as a reviewer, you know, who is this intended audience. You know, obviously it's put out there by the marketing and the publishers and so forth, so we kind of have a general idea, but there's times when I'll dive into a book and I'm like, I don't know, this could really work either way. So, you know, I know that for some of you, you have not written what is considered YA, but certainly I think this is something that we can all chime in about. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on kind of this blend of the ages as well.
You know, talking about target audiences, I guess one thing to keep in mind is that I've heard that kids always read at least 2 years ahead of their grade or their year or whatever, you know. So if an 11-year-old picks up a book and looks on the back and it says for 13 plus, they're not going to put that book back. You know, they're going to probably be drawn to it more, I suspect.
Something that I always think about, because I do write for a young adult audience, is it's not as much the age of the character as it is the experience of the character. You can have an adult horror novel that has a 16-year-old as the main character, but I feel like for books that are marketed toward teens, then the experience should be questions and confusion and issues and themes that would be relevant to teens. And so when I'm writing for teens, I think about the kinds of questions that I was struggling with as a teen in terms of identity, in terms of sexuality, in terms of fears and questions about the future. And I try to keep those themes central in my work. I mean, some of those questions, of course, are universal. Everybody is thinking about the future and their identity throughout all stages of their lives. But when I think back to how present and urgent and overwhelming and frightening and electrifying those questions felt when I was a teen, how everything feels vital and everything feels important, I try to keep that feeling central to my YA stories. And I think that's part of what makes young adult stories a little bit different from adult stories.
Yeah, I'm at a loss on this one. I
Well,
honestly have no idea.
You know,
yeah, I'm thinking about it. I was speaking to some librarians at the American Library Association conference in February, I think it was. And I was speaking to high school librarians specifically. And I was saying, so what are your students in high school checking out from the library, right? Like, just because I'm curious. And she was saying that, you know, they won't check out books if the characters are younger than them, right? They don't like to feel that they're reading something below their level. And horror and fantasy is really very much what they want, what, you know, young adults want to read. And I think, you know, like what I was saying before, is that that emotional intensity that's in horror and science fiction is mirrored in what you're feeling at that age. Everything is new, everything is intense. It's not, there's no mediation of experience between what you're feeling and what you're reading. And so I don't know, I think I can't really speak to the difference between adult and you know, young adult, because I don't write young adult, but you know, just from speaking to librarians, that was sort of what they were telling me.
You know, I've had a lot of 16 and 17-year-old characters, protagonists in my novels. And one of my friends a few years ago, he told me, he said, "Hey, Steven, you're really good at doing that teenage angst." And I was like, thank you. And then I was leaving like an hour later, and I realized he was probably insulting me. You know,
Some of us never leave, right? Like some of us
I
are in our
know
40s, and like that's exactly where we still are.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, I have no reason to insult you, and I agree with him. I definitely get that, and I felt that reading Mongrels also. I was just like, he really got the youth vibe down, and I wasn't expecting that from you. That was actually the first novel I read by yours, and then of course I've read more since. But and then Miss Legrand, I think you did a phenomenal job because it's been quite some time since I've actually read a YA novel, and it took me a minute to kind of get in the rhythm of your book because of the fact that I was cognizant that it was YA, but I had to kind of do what you were saying. I had to set that foundation knowing, okay, the intended audience is this, but I just think you hit the mark in every level. I just feel that you touched on all the right points. There was so much emotion and power, and those female characters were just those are girls that you would want to have as friends. Maybe not Val as much as the rest of them because she could light you on fire, but she grew on me too. But no, it was beautiful, and the way it ended really just kind of brought it all together.
Thank you.
I am really sad to say that we have reached our hour. I am horribly sad about this because I feel like I could talk to the five of you forever, and I just feel like there's so much more that we could talk about. But if any of you ever want to talk about horror and you have nothing better to do, well, come over to Cammie's Corner and I'll be happy to talk to you about horror. That's what I do. But I do want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules and for talking to us about your new books. I cannot rave about them enough, and I will continue to do so. Of course, after this broadcast ends, this will be available on my channel. And of course, as I indicated in the description panel, is all the information about the Social Distancing Book Fest. If you have any questions or concerns, please leave those for me in the comments, and I will be sure to check my comments and get back to you. Do you all have anything to add before we jump off air? Anything that you'd like our audience to know, or anything maybe that you feel we left out today?
Well, thank you for keeping us all in line.
Yeah, thank you, Cammie. This was really fun.
Yeah, this was a
I
blast.
did my best. I'm glad you all had a great time, and I can't thank you enough. Thank you again so much for taking the time out. So I will end this here, and I hope you all stay safe. And of course, to our audience, everyone stay safe out there. I'll talk to you all soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.